Hi folks, so more information regarding the Final Fantasy VII Remake coming out today, and this is courtesy of an interview conducted by fandom.com with the man himself, the producer of the remake, Yoshinori Kitase. We're going to be taking a look at some of the things that Kitase says here. The general scope of this interview is that Kitase is addressing the philosophy of where Square approached the remake from, and I'm going to be leaving a link to this article in the video description for you to look at in greater detail. Now, in some ways, if you think about it, the Final Fantasy VII Remake has such a huge hurdle to overcome that you might even argue it's setting itself up for failure. When you think about just how high the pedestal is that Final Fantasy VII has been put on by the fans themselves over the last 20 years or so, that anything Square do to that game at all, is it going to help it at all? Because it's already been lifted to the point where it cannot be seen as, you know, anything greater than it already is, surely. So anything Square do to try and improve upon it is only going to make things worse. Well, I think Square have understood that challenge, and, you know, it took them a long time, of course. Fans were asking for a remake for many, many years before they responded with a positive to that, but they did do so. They have responded to that challenge. They know what people, what their thoughts are towards the original game. They know the legacy that that game is bringing with it into the remake, and they know that there's going to be a lot of expectations which they're going to have to meet. So regardless of what you think of some of the choices that Square have made when approaching how they're going to develop the remake, and I know there's a lot of controversy about some of those choices, at the end of the day, Square, I think, are trying to do service to the game. Now, of course, they're trying to make money as well, and, you know, splitting the game into several parts is certainly probably going to help with that. But I think they are trying to do justice to the scope of the original game for the next generation, and that's pretty much what Kitase is talking about in this interview. The interview first focuses on the fact that Kitase himself said that he was focused on the philosophy, and in fact the whole development team are focused on the philosophy of how they were going to approach the remake. Now, of course, whenever you come to a new project, whatever it's going to be, the first stage is actually deciding how you want to approach that project and what the scope of it's going to be, what the design of it's going to be, etc, etc. But the fact that this is the very first thing that they're always talking about in interviews makes it sound like this was an even bigger issue for the Final Fantasy VII Remake than perhaps it would be for some other projects. For example, Final Fantasy VIII, the remaster, was clearly not a big conversation. As a matter of fact, we've looked at other interviews about this, it seemed to be a last minute thing. There was already bringing the game out to current generation consoles. It was a last minute decision, hey, let's upgrade the visuals before we do so. That was the philosophy for that game. A quick decision, probably not a lot of thought went into it, but it'll do the job for what it's trying to do. Now, for Final Fantasy VII, that's a completely different situation, and it sounds like a lot of time, perhaps many, many months of discussions, went into deciding just how they're going to be realising the project, and in particular the scope of this game. Now, one of the first interesting things that Kitase mentions here is where he says that we are now very much approaching this as if we are developing the next main numbered Final Fantasy game. Now, I've often suggested that I expect Final Fantasy VII, the remake, to be seen as the next major, you know, Final Fantasy franchise, which sounds strange because it's already part of an existing franchise with number 7, but we have to try and see it in the same sense that Final Fantasy 13 was a franchise containing multiple games. Final Fantasy 15 was its own franchise, really, containing, well, one game, but then multiple pieces of content that could be purchased along with, you know, extra forms of media such as anime and the movie and what have you. And that's pretty much the approach they're going to be taking to Final Fantasy VII the Remake. Now, of course, all of that is also going to fit in the overarching franchise of Final Fantasy VII, which is in itself in Final Fantasy, the whole genre. But interestingly, what I noted about this was how it's being compared to the next main numbered entry. Now, we do know, of course, that there's not going to be any major Final Fantasy numbered game coming out before Final Fantasy VII next year. I mean, they're leaving that a little bit too late if that is going to be the case, to announce it and to hype it up and stuff. But it makes me think that they're not really focusing on Final Fantasy 16 at the moment, which seems to perhaps contradict some of the rumours and the stuff that's going across the internet with the various, development projects that are going on at the various different teams at Square Enix. A lot of people have concluded, and I have made videos on this, that Final Fantasy 16 may be one of those. But I'm just not getting any hints of that from the various interviews coming out of Square. A lot of them are just talking about the fact, including this here from Kitase, that Final Fantasy VII Remake is being seen as the next entry in the Final Fantasy franchise. Now, it could, of course, just mean that Final Fantasy 16 is coming out the following year or something, and this would still be the next entry. But I don't think that's going to be the case. It does sound very much like Final Fantasy VII is having all of the resources put towards it that would otherwise be going towards Final Fantasy 16, if that makes sense. So it's really taking the place of that, which in my view is probably a good thing. I know that Square have multiple development teams, but the Final Fantasy VII Remake is such a big project, and the main point of this interview is to talk about just how grand in scope this project really is, that would it really work if they were diverting attention away from it to other big Final Fantasy games? I'm not sure that it would. And guys, if you want a Final Fantasy VII Remake, then I think there's just going to have to be other sacrifices made along the way, and Final Fantasy 16 is probably going to be one of those. Now, what is also interesting here is how Kitase suggests that the idea to split the remake into several games as opposed to just releasing it as one game was not some kind of business decision. It was very much a decision that came from the creative side of the team. Now, I'm not going to obviously speculate on whether that's truly the case, or just how much of an influence the executives at Square had on this decision, but it does sound like the general philosophy that they are using to approach the game is one of let's make the original bigger and grander in every possible way. So Kitase says, we really wanted to go above and beyond what you'd expect from a standard remake, to delve that much deeper into this classic and the world and characters that feature in it. But in order to realise this world at that kind of scale, we really did have a massive volume of work to do. So this episodic approach allows us to remake the original without having to cut down on anything that the fans loved about the original game. There's a huge amount of data squeezed into this game. The result of this is that the first game now spans a 2 Blu-ray disc set. So they've already told us before, and Kitase is clarifying here, they're not cutting content from the original game, though we do know they are going to be adjusting and changing content for various reasons. For example, the big one is going to be the whole cross-dressing scene, the Honeybee Mansion, Don Corneo section of the original game is going to be changed. We don't know how much, but it is going to be changed for the remake, though nothing, according to Kitase, is actually being cut from the experience. Although what we also know is that they are adding to the original game. There's going to be new plot points, new characters, new exploration options. In fact, there's going to be a whole wealth of new stuff to do during the course of the adventure. This is why a lot of people at first were concerned when the episodic approach was announced, that they were basically making one game, but in order to make money, they were literally just cutting that game up into 3 and releasing each part as a full priced game. But that's not what's happening here. It has been said before, and Kitase is just reiterating that each episode is going to be huge. It's going to be the size of a full game in and of itself. And we already know, of course, that the first game, this is what's coming out next year, the Midgar section that's being released in March, itself is going to be a 2 Blu-ray disc game. Though in my view, there are still a few questions that Square, I think, do need to answer fairly quickly. Definitely before the first part is actually released. There are a lot of questions that people are asking that perhaps even Square themselves don't know the answer to yet, such as how is progress going to be translated, or transferred rather, from one episode to another. A lot of people are interested in that. For example, exactly what's the scope going to be of the later episodes? When can we expect to see some of the important details, the important plot points of the original Final Fantasy VII, such as the death of Aerith, amongst others? Is that going to be in episode 2, or is that something we're going to have to invest in for some time before it actually happens? These are really important questions that I do think Square need to start narrowing down a little bit, even if we don't get total specifics about it. Just at least acknowledge that this is something that Square are themselves hearing from us, that they are working on, and that they are going to have answers to. But so far Square haven't said anything about this, which is a little bit concerning, I think, for many. But Kitase goes on to say that the remake's going to have a very, very strong emphasis and focus on the characters themselves, which is something that we've already been seeing, and to be honest, I think it's only going to enhance the original game if they do it right. So we know we've got voice acting. Voice acting doesn't always work. If it doesn't work, it can have the effect of drawing you out of the experience rather than immersing you into it, so that's got to be done right. The music, which I'm confident with Nobuo Uematsu having some role in that. We don't know exactly what his role is, but we know that he's on board to some degree with the remake, that that's going to be something that we're all going to look forward to. The music, the soundtrack of the original game is fantastic. They're obviously going to be drawing heavily from that. And also the fact that the characters have their own expressions and the focus on storytelling that we just couldn't get with the original game is something that I am looking forward to. For example, just this is my example here, you've got the original Avalanche members with Jesse, Biggs and Wedge, and of course they meet a tragic end during the Midgar section of the original game, and you do kind of get emotionally invested in that part of the story, but it's not really dwelt on, it's not really focused on, it's just referenced a couple of times afterwards. But I think in the remake there's going to be so much of a heavy focus on that part of the game, and so much of a dwelling on those characters before that actually occurs, that event takes place, that the characters are probably going to be just as heavily invested in those trio of characters. In particular, it looks like Jesse is going to be a strong focus here, that players are going to be just as heavily invested in those characters as we were in the character of Aerith in the original game. And of course, her death had quite an impact on many people that played that. I think we're going to be getting something similar here with these other characters that never really came out in the original. And finally, Kitase expands on the whole concept of introducing voice acting to the original Final Fantasy VII. Of course, that original game had none, but the remake is going to be fully voice acted. I think what's confusing a lot of people is the fact that they are having a completely new cast to do this voice acting. Now, of course, as I say, the original game didn't have any, but other titles in the Final Fantasy VII compilation did start to introduce voice actors, which are pretty much stuck around for the various, projects in the Final Fantasy VII universe since, to have a consistency of voices across all of those various games and projects. But that's been scrapped, it appears, for the remake, with a new team coming on, a new cast coming on. And there's not really been any reason given as to why this is the case. In fact, some would say that Square have handled this rather poorly. Some of the voice actors, the original voice actors themselves, have said they don't even know if they're going to be called upon for reprising their roles in the remake, because Square just aren't speaking to them or contacting them one way or another. And yet Kitase says that those original voice actors are still going to be used for other projects in the Final Fantasy VII franchise. So it seems like they're purposefully creating a little bit of inconsistency here. They want to keep the original cast for projects that aren't the remake, but they want a new voice cast for the remake. I'm not sure what that's about. Maybe it's just to do with money. I don't know. Perhaps the original cast, Square thought, would expect to be paid a lot more than having a newer cast, because it would be such a huge project in a franchise that they've become well known for by that point. I'm just literally pulling at straws here. I have no idea. Perhaps they just thought that the quality of the work of the original voice cast wasn't sufficient for a game of this magnitude that's going to be drawing so much attention to the Final Fantasy VII brand. Again, Square haven't commented on this, so we just really can't know one way or another. But yeah, so we are getting a fully voice acted experience with a new cast, of course. But overall, there's still a lot that I want to know about the Final Fantasy VII Remake, and I'm really looking forward to getting answers to some of those burning questions over the coming months. Above all, though, I can't wait to get my hands on it, so Square, I know you're probably not watching this video, but if by any chance you are, maybe, give us that demo that a lot of people praised so well at E3 that got their hands on it. We'd be very grateful for that, but of course, we look forward to playing the game whenever that opportunity becomes available. So thanks so much, guys, for stopping by and checking out the video. Don't forget to check out the original article, link in the description, and I'll see you next time. Take care, have a great day.
Sounds like you're having fun.